hand fingernail swabs, fingernail cuttings, nail clippers, right knee swabs, left foot heel swabs, left and right breast swabs, neck swabs, partial mouthpiece swabs, lips, chin, and nares swabs, forehead swabs, and debris collected from hair.
And then the remainder of the items that were submitted.
Buckle standard from Eugene Mitchell, hat, audio video cable from living room floor, TV antenna from living room floor, panties from pile of clothes next to bedroom closet, exterior door knob from bathroom into bedroom, interior door knob from bathroom into bedroom, swabs from rim of Heaven Hill plastic vodka bottle, piece of foil and medical tape from floor of pantry kitchen. Buckle standard from Guy Marcus Allen, black hooded footlocker coat. Buckle standard from Terrence Spalding, one hair from mattress cutting and bedroom hand towel.
Okay, and we've heard some testimony, so I'll ask you to look at, and I'll try not to confuse you. We obviously had some scheduling changes in this trial, and so some of the witnesses are a little bit out of order. So we've seen some of the items introduced, and I'm going to ask you just to look at the envelopes that were introduced yesterday that have already been marked and kind of explain to the jury, just look at them kind of as a whole and talk about how you recognize that these items are the ones that were submitted to the Kentucky State Police Lab.
Whenever I receive evidence, I will initial, and it will have a barcode with the laboratory number and item number. And I know that I had this in my custody because of the my initials are on this.
So I'll just walk through so that I don't make it any more confusing for people. Just each individual item that we're talking about that the jury saw yesterday. So cloth material with unknown substance. Is that an item that you examined in this case?
Yes.
All right. And condom with unknown substance.
Yes, it has my lab number, item number, and initials.
All right. Piece of unknown substance.
Yes, this has my lab number, item number, and initials.
2 swabs of unknown substance from Exhibit 15, which was the condom.
Yes, this as well has my item number, lab number, and initials.
Okay. And 2 swabs from Exhibit 8 that CSU government talked about yesterday.
My laboratory item number and initials are on this one as well.
Nightgown with possible blood.
The lab number and item number and the barcode is covered up, but I can see that my initials are on this item.
Okay, and if you would, we talked with crime scene technician Betterman yesterday. There's an envelope in that package. I'm not going to ask you to open it. We won't ask you to put on gloves or anything. But does the lab sometimes take items and separate out individual pieces or cuttings?
Yes, when the serological analysis is initially conducted, the serologist will take cuttings of a stain. They need DNA testing.
All right, and the LMPD's Exhibit 14, condom with unknown substances. Was that also analyzed?
Yes, it has my lab number, item number, and initials.
And 14A, the swabs.
Yes, my lab number, item number, and initials are on this item as well.
All right, and then control swabs. Are they submitted to the lab every time?
Not every time, but we do receive control swabs.
All right. And the sexual assault evidence collection kit, was that received by the lab? Or were items that came from the sexual assault kit received by the lab?
Yes, it has my lab number, item number, and initials.
number of these. I'm also going to show you what's been marked as Commonwealth exhibits 136, 137, 138, and 139. Do you recognize those envelopes?
This item was never in my custody. It might have come, it looks like it has been at the lab and has gone to another analyst, but this one has not been in my custody.
Okay.
The buccal swabs from Eugene Mitchell has my laboratory number, item number, and initials. One does not have my item number or lab number or initials on it.
Okay.
This one, the buccal swabs from Guy Allen has my laboratory number, item number, and initials. And I had this one as well.
Okay. So Your Honor, the Commonwealth would move to admit exhibits 136 and 138, which are buccal swabs from Eugene Mitchell and Guy Allen.
Any objection?
We approached this for a moment.
Yeah.
I got off in the count.
Just a second, excuse me, sorry.
All right, so exhibits number 137 and 139, so admitted.
And I'm going to move these items back out of your way. I just wanted to make sure that we were clear about the items that we're talking about today, since the jury saw them yesterday. All right, so let's start with, obviously there were a lot of items that were submitted. So we're going to go kind of in the best order that I could put them to make it a little less complicated. But first, let's talk about the DNA testing from the items that were contained in the sexual assault examination and collection kit.
The vaginal swabs were serologically tested and DNA tested on, and that is my item 9.1. Item 9.1 contains P30 Other testing for semen was negative.
All right, what is P30?
P30 is a constituent found in semen.
So does that indicate the presence of semen?
Whenever I am doing my testing to identify semen, there are 3 different tests that I can conduct. One is a presumptive test that's looking for a constituent in semen called acid phosphatase. A second one is to identify sperm cells. And then another one is the P30, which is a constituent. It's found in high concentrations in semen, but can also be found in other parts of the body.
Okay. All right, so I'm sorry, go ahead and continue.
No saliva was found on item 9.1, vaginal swabs.
All right, and was there any additional testing on 9.1, the vaginal swabs?
Yes, the female DNA profile from item 9.1, vaginal swabs from Sheila Devine, is consistent with Sheila Devine. This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell or Guy Allen.
Okay, so let's talk about what that result means. Is a vaginal swab something that you would refer to as an intimate sample?
Yes,
And what does that mean?
that means that it comes from a known individual.
Okay, so if you're taking swabs of the victim's vaginal area, would you expect to find her DNA?
Yes,
All right, and when it says that it doesn't match Eugene Mitchell or Guy Marcus Allen, was your result that it was consistent with Sheila Devine's DNA?
yes. So whenever I'm doing comparisons and I have a profile from an item, and I will do comparisons from all of the individuals or the standards that are submitted to compare. So even though I say it's consistent with Sheila Devine, I also have to draw exclusions on that.
Okay, so if you had Guy Marcus Allen, and Eugene Mitchell's DNA, even if your testing shows that it's consistent with Sheila Devine's DNA, you're still going to do a comparison against the other 2 individuals.
Yes,
And so again, for the vaginal swabs, the DNA that was present was consistent with Sheila's DNA.
yes.
All right, can we move on to then the oral swabs from Sheila?
Item 9.3, oral swabs from Sheila Devine contain semen.
And was there additional testing?
The DNA profile from item 9.3, oral swabs from Sheila Devine, is consistent with a mixture of at least 2 individuals. Sheila Devine and Guy Allen can be included as contributors to this mixture. An estimated 1 person in 21 billion random unrelated individuals could be a contributor to this mixture based on the relevant United States populations. Eugene Mitchell can be excluded as a contributor to this mixture.
Okay, so the oral swabs, as the sexual assault nurse examiner testified to, we're talking about the swabs from the inside of her mouth.
Yes.
Okay, and explain a little bit about then when it's a mixture, what your statistic means.
Whenever I am looking at a profile that is a mixture, I can determine how many people are included. Since we receive half of our DNA from our mom, half of our DNA from our father, the DNA profile that I obtain has numerical values from each location of the DNA that I'm looking at. If there are more than 2, I know that I've got a mixture. And so with this sample, I know that I have at least a mixture of 2 individuals, and I can do a statistical calculation on that based on how the DNA is inherited. So it could be multiplied, and the estimated frequencies in the database is what gives me this large number.
Okay. And so from the oral swabs, again, would you expect to find Sheila Devine's DNA in swabs from inside her own mouth?
Yes.
And then the mixture was consistent with Sheila Devine and Guy Marcus Allen?
Yes, with the estimated frequency.
Okay. And the next item, 9.4 from the sexual assault kit?
I also did YSTRs on.
Oh, I'm sorry, right, go ahead.
The YSTR profile from item 9.3 Oral swabs from Sheila Devine matches Guy Allen and his paternal relatives at all loci. Utilizing the US YSTR database, the profile has been observed in 0 of 5,871 African Americans, 0 of 6,714 Caucasians, and 0 of 3,504 Hispanics. Applying a 95% upper confidence interval, this profile is expected to occur with the following frequencies: 1 in 1,961 African Americans, 1 in 2,242 Caucasians, and 1 in 1,171 Hispanics. This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell.
Okay. Can you explain a little bit about the statistics for YSTR and why they are different than the statistics for, was the original test what we call the autosomal DNA?
Yes. So first I will do autosomal DNA. And the reason why the calculations are so different is because of the way that the DNA is inherited for males. The Y chromosome is inherited as a chunk. So the paternal lines would have the same DNA profile or YSTR profile. Unless a mutational event had occurred, they might vary some, but father, grandfather, father, son would have the exact same YSTR profile.
Right. And when we're talking about autosomal, can you distinguish between someone and a male and their father and a male sibling using autosomal DNA?
Yes, with autosomal, they are different from person to person, except for identical siblings.
Okay, so the initial testing that included Guy Allen in the mixture, that was autosomal.
Yes, that was autosomal.
All right, and then the additional YSTR also matched dimer percentage.
Yes, with the estimated frequencies.
Okay. All right, let's move on to the external genital swabs.
Item 9.4, external genital swabs from Sheila Devine contained blood. Presumptive testing for human origin was positive. Item 9.4 contained semen, and no saliva was found on item 9.4. The autosomal DNA results, the quantity and or quality of human DNA from item 9.4, external genital swabs from Sheila Devine, the sperm fraction was insufficient to obtain a profile.
Can you explain what that means?
Yes, whenever I'm doing my DNA analysis and I know that there is semen present from the serological analysis, I will split up the sperm and the non-sperm fractions and get a profile from each fraction. And how that is done is through a process called a differential. And DNA is a multi-step process. And in order for me to get clean profiles is to separate those sperm cells from the rest of the DNA. And that's what I'm talking about when I say sperm and non-sperm fraction.
Okay, so as part of a serology analysis, you distinguish then the difference between, at least in some instances, you're able to distinguish the difference between blood, saliva, semen, other fluids, right?
Yes.
Okay, and all right, so when we say that it's insufficient for analysis, is it possible to have a DNA sample that's too small for you to develop a meaningful profile?
There can be a lot of different reasons that there just isn't enough sperm cells there, or the sample could be inhibited, or I'm just not getting results from there. So there can be some external factors that may affect my results.
All right, and let me just ask to be clear, where does semen originate?
The male sex organ.
All right, moving on to, so from the external genital swabs.
I have one more result from 9.4.
Okay.
The partial female DNA profile from item 9.4, external genital swabs from Sheila Devine, non-sperm fraction is consistent with Sheila Devine. This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell or Guy Allen.
And the next item, anal swabs.
Item 9.5, anal swabs. Item 9.5 contains blood. Presumptive testing for human origin was positive. Item 9.5 contains semen. And the autosomal results for item 9.5, the DNA profile from item 9.5, anal swabs from Sheila Devine, is consistent with a mixture of at least 2 individuals. Although Guy Allen is inconclusive at 4 of the locations, Guy Allen and Sheila Devine can be included as contributors to this mixture. An estimated 1 person in 92 million random unrelated individuals could be a contributor to this mixture based on the relevant United States populations. Eugene Mitchell can be excluded as a contributor to this mixture.
All right, let's talk a little bit about what you mean when you say that cannot be included at certain locations.
Whenever I'm doing the DNA analysis, there are specific locations on the DNA. And I am getting results from each location if I have good quality DNA. If the DNA is limited or something is going on with the sample itself, I may not get results at all of those locations. So my result when I say at 4 of the locations are inconclusive, it's those locations that I'm not comparing.
Okay, but did you still have enough locations consistent with each other to make a comparison and reach a conclusion?
Yes, I still did do a comparison.
Okay, and again, that conclusion was that Guy Marcus Allen could be included.
Estimate. Guy Allen and Sheila Devine can be included as contributors to this mixture, an estimated 1 person in 92 million random unrelated individuals.
Okay, and you were able to exclude Eugene Mitchell as a contributor.
Yes.
All right, and the next item from the sexual assault kit.
Item 9.9, left and right hand fingernail swabs. The DNA profile from item 9.9, left and right hand fingernail swabs from Sheila Devine matches Sheila Devine at all loci. This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell or Guy Allen. Additional DNA is present, but is too limited for interpretation.
Okay. So, and again, is that the autosomal DNA?
Yes.
Okay. Were you able to do additional testing?
Yes. The YSTR profile from item 9.9, left and right hand fingernail swabs from Sheila Devine, is a mixture. Guy Allen and Eugene Mitchell and their paternal relatives can be included as contributors to this mixture. Utilizing profiles from the US YSTR database, this profile has been observed in 39 of 2,817 African Americans, 95 of 3,299 Caucasians, 33 of 1,711 Hispanics, 3 of 118 Native Americans, and 1 of 603 Asians. Applying a 95% upper confidence interval, this profile is expected to occur with the following frequencies: 1 in 55 African Americans, 1 in 29 Caucasians, 1 in 39 Hispanics, 1 in 16 Native Americans, and 1 in 128 Asians.
Okay, so again, explain, so the initial testing, you were able to isolate Sheila Devine's DNA, but the additional DNA, you couldn't do an interpretation with the autosomal method, correct?
So yes, with autosomal, I know that there is a second contributor. And also with the multi-step process for DNA, I can determine whether or not male DNA is present. And with autosomal, I was able to get a result from that, but also able to get a YSTR result because of the way I'm only looking at male DNA. And so I'm not looking at any of the female DNA and only specifically looking at the male chromosome.
Okay, so it's a process that isolates the male DNA from the sample as a whole?
Yes.
Okay. All right, and the next item in the sexual assault kit?
Item 9.14, left and right breast swabs. No saliva was found on item 9.14. The YSTR profile from item 9.14, left and right breast swabs from Sheila Devine, is a mixture. Although he is inconclusive as a contributor at one of the locations, Guy Allen and his paternal relatives can be included as contributors to this mixture. Utilizing profiles from the US YSTR database, this profile has been observed in 3 of 2,817 African Americans, 15 of 3,299 Caucasians, and 4 of 1,711 Hispanics. Applying a 95% upper confidence interval, this profile is expected to occur with the following frequencies: 1 in 364 African Americans, 1 in 143 Caucasians, and 1 in 187 Hispanics. Eugene Mitchell can be excluded as a contributor to this mixture.
Okay, so Eugene Mitchell's DNA was not present in the left and right breast swabs.
He was excluded from the mixture.
All right, and the additional swabs? We move on to 9.15.
Item 9.15, neck swabs from Sheila Devine. No saliva was found on item 9.15. The female DNA profile from item 9.15 matches Sheila Devine at all loci. The estimated frequency of this profile is 1 person in 150 sextillion based on the relevant United States populations. This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell or Guy Allen. Additional DNA is present, but is too limited for interpretation. The YSTR profile from item 9.15, neck swabs from Sheila Devine, is a mixture. The major YSTR profile matches Guy Allen and his paternal relatives. Utilizing the US YSTR database, this profile has been observed in 0 of 5,871 African Americans, 0 of 6,714 Caucasians, and 0 of 3,504 Hispanics. Applying a 95% upper confidence interval, this profile is expected to occur with the following frequencies: 1 in 1,961 African Americans, 1 in 2,242 Caucasians, and 1 in 1,171 Hispanics. Eugene Mitchell can be excluded as a contributor to this mixture.
Okay, so again, the DNA, when you said initially that Guy Marcus Allen and Eugene Mitchell were excluded from the first sample, that's the sample that matched Sheila, that was consistent with Sheila Devine.
The item 9.15.
Yes.
Yes, the autosomal, the female DNA profile from item 9.15, neck swabs from Sheila Devine matches Sheila Devine at all loci.
Okay. And so again, and we're talking in these, the swabs from her neck, her lips and nares, and her forehead, correct?
Now, this is the item 9.15, neck swabs. There's other swabs from lips, chin, and nares swabs.
All right, let's move on then to 9.17.
(9.17) are lips, chin, and nair swabs from Sheila Devine. The female DNA profile from item 9.17 is consistent with Sheila Devine. This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell, Guy Allen, or Terrence Spalding. Additional DNA is present on item 9.17, but is too limited for interpretation. The YSTR profile from item 9.17 matches Guy Allen and his paternal relatives. Utilizing the US YSTR database and assuming a single source profile, the DNA match probability of Guy Allen being the source of the YSTR profile as opposed to a randomly selected individual from the same population is estimated to be 1,852 times more likely for African Americans, 2,165 times more likely for Caucasians, 1,454 times more likely for Hispanics. The YSTR profile from 9.17 does not match Eugene Mitchell or Terrence Spalding.
Okay. And when we're talking about, I want to be clear, when we're talking about the database and the statistics that you're giving, when you're doing the comparison, are you using a profile that you developed, a DNA profile that you developed from the sample and comparing it to a DNA profile that you developed from the known DNA from the defendant?
So whenever I'm doing my analysis, I obtain a DNA profile, either autosomal or YSTR profile. If it's for a YSTR profile, that will be entered into a database with known YSTR profiles and checked against to see how many times it's observed in that database. And that is what I use to calculate the statistic. And once the statistical calculation is done, I can do a comparison from that unknown profile to the standards that I received from Eugene Mitchell, Guy Allen, or Terrence Spalding.
Okay, so I don't know if I asked you that when we got started. So how do you develop a DNA profile from Guy Marcus Allen?
It's the same process for the unknown standards or the unknown samples. Whenever the items come into the laboratory, I first will examine all of the unknown items and take the necessary cuttings that are going to go on for DNA analysis. That process will be done first, and then the standards will be processed second. And it's the same multi-step process that I use with the unknowns and get a profile from those standards in order to do comparisons.
Okay, so when you develop a profile for the defendant, is it from the buccal swabs that were collected either by a detective or a crime scene unit technician directly from the defendant?
Yes, so standards are submitted. It's either a buccal, which would be from the mouth, or it's a blood standard that I can use for comparison, and it's from a known individual.
Okay, and so you create a DNA profile from that and then compare it to the DNA profiles that you create from the evidence.
Yes.
Okay, all right. All right, let's next move on then to 9.17.
We just finished that one.
Oh, sorry, 9.18.
9.18 forehead swabs. The YSTR profile from the female DNA profile from item 9.18 swabs of forehead from Sheila Devine is consistent with Sheila Devine. This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell, Guy Allen, or Terrence Spalding. The YSTR profile from item 9.18 is a mixture. Although no results were obtained at one of the locations and two of them are inconclusive, the major profile matches Guy Allen and his paternal relatives at all other loci. Utilizing the US YSTR database and assuming a single source profile, the match probability of Guy Allen being the source of the YSTR profile as opposed to a randomly selected individual from the same population is estimated to be 1,471 times more likely African American, 1,661 times more likely for Caucasian, 1,208 times more likely for Hispanics. Due to the major YSTR profile from item 9.18 does not match Eugene Mitchell or Terrence Spalding. Due to the limited presence of the minor contributor, no meaningful comparisons can be made.
Okay, so let's talk about what a major contributor and minor contributor means for DNA analysis.
Whenever I am looking at a profile that's obtained from the unknown item, I can determine how much one person is contributing their DNA than another one. So I can see that with a major profile that they're contributing more DNA than someone else, which would be the minor. And sometimes with the minor, I can pull them out and actually do comparisons, but sometimes that minor contributor is too limited and no comparisons can even be made to that.
All right, so let me ask you to explain a little bit about our different sources of DNA richer sources of DNA?
Yes, so that's why we do serological analysis, because biological fluids such as blood, semen, and saliva are rich sources of DNA. And that's where we can focus our attention to get good quality DNA profiles.
And what do you mean by rich sources of DNA?
They contain a lot of DNA, the biological fluids.
Okay, so we hear a lot about touch DNA. What's the difference between, I guess, the availability of DNA that can be analyzed in blood or semen versus touch DNA?
So touch DNA would be if your body comes in contact with an object or surface. Usually it would be a hand that comes in contact with a surface, and we are looking at cells from just brief contact.
Okay, so if you're isolating a sample to get DNA, will you have, I guess, a smaller sample of DNA to examine from touch DNA than you would from fluids like saliva or blood or semen?
So with the biological fluids, I know that I would get a good DNA profile because there would be a lot of DNA there. With touch samples, it could be so limited that I might get a profile from the item or I might not. With my experience, I get limited results from touch.
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about, are there samples in which you can detect that DNA is present, but there's not enough DNA to generate a meaningful profile?
Yes, just like I explained before, I might be able to pull out a major contributor and do comparisons to that, but the minor contributor might not be compared just for the simple fact there's not enough there for me to include or exclude.
And is determining whether or not the sample is sufficient, is that part of the lab standards that are in place for analysts to use?
Yes, there is an optimal amount of DNA that I know that will give me good results. And if I'm looking at just a little bit of DNA, I know that my results might not be complete.
Okay. So at the Kentucky State Police Lab, you're only going to do a comparison and provide results if there's a sufficient sample. Is that fair to say?
Yes, if I have, because we do have a guidelines that we follow when doing comparisons to single source profiles and also mixture profiles. And if it is too limited and doesn't meet those certain guidelines, then the profile will not be compared.
Is that because is the reason for the standards to make sure that the comparisons are more reliable?
Yes, and it also to make sure that analysts are consistent with each other.
Okay. All right, we've gone through the items. Well, let's move on to 9.16 that was submitted with the sexual assault kit. Did you perform testing on that?
Yes.
And what were your results there?
Item 9.16, partial mouthpiece swab. The DNA profile from item 9.16 is a mixture of at least 2 individuals. Assuming the presence of Sheila Devine, the remaining profile is too limited for comparisons. So that basically means that I can, since it is an intimate sample, I can apply Sheila Devine's profile to that mixture, and anything that is left over, I cannot compare and do inclusions or exclusions to.
Okay. So when we talk about that you can't compare them, does that mean that it's yet another, is it necessarily someone else's DNA other than Guy Allen or Eugene Mitchell?
Yes, I'm not saying anything about it or doing any comparisons to it. So there's not going to be a statement on whether they're included or excluded to that additional DNA.
Okay, let me try to clarify. So the fact that you can't do a comparison, that doesn't mean that it's not theirs. It's simply that you're not able to analyze it, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And item 9.19, the debris collected from the hair did you do any analysis on it?
I did not.
All right. Now that we've moved through the sexual assault kit, let me ask you a little bit about the case acceptance policy at the Kentucky State Police Lab before we move on to the other items that we're testing. Explain to the jury a little bit about the lab's case acceptance policy.
Yes, so whenever items are received at the lab, we have a case acceptance policy for serology and DNA. For DNA analysis, if the case is a sexual assault, we would receive or do DNA analysis on 3 of the unknown items. If it is a homicide case, we would do up to 10 items for DNA. If there's more individuals involved, we can do more analysis, but then that is where we start initially.
Okay. What's the reason for the case acceptance policy?
The case acceptance policy is in place for us to be able to limit the number of samples that we're doing DNA on, so that we have time to work other cases as well for DNA or serology.
Does the Kentucky State Police Lab accept evidence from, is it essentially the forensic lab for the entire state?
Yes.
So all 120 counties in Kentucky submit evidence to the State Police Lab for testing.
Yes, the Central Laboratory in Frankfurt does all the DNA for the state of Kentucky.
And does the lab only receive items for DNA testing in sexual assault and homicide cases?
No, we also have different sections in the laboratory for drugs, toxicology, firearms, trace, APHIS, breath alcohol. We accept evidence for those sections as well.
Okay. And does the Kentucky State Police Lab also do DNA testing for other violent crimes like shootings, robberies? It's not just homicides and sexual assaults, am I correct?
Right. We have a property crime section as well that we do DNA analysis on those types of cases as well.
Okay. And does your experience as an analyst help you decide which items are most appropriate for testing?
Yes. Initially, whenever I receive all of the items and try to decide which ones will be taken on for DNA analysis, I will look at the KSP, the Kentucky State Police submission form, and look at the case history, as well as talking with the officer to determine which samples would be extracted for DNA.
Okay. So typically you and the lead officer would have some conversations about at least which items to test initially.
Yes,
And did that happen in this case?
it did.
All right. And at some point, did you have additional conversations with Sergeant Jason Vance and submit additional or analyze additional items?
Yes.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about, I guess if we can move back to lab item 2, the nightgown,
Yes.
which I think are your reports 1 and 2.
Yes.
Okay. And if I'm jumping around in a way that's not helpful for you, please tell me and we'll try to reorganize. All right. So let's talk about the testing that was performed on the nightgown. And the jury saw the nightgown yesterday when the crime scene unit technician testified. So can you explain, once the lab received the nightgown, what process was initially done?
Initially, whenever I received the nightgown, I would do serology on that item. So whenever I opened the item to examine it, I first collected hairs, and then I observed any stains that were present on the nightgown and tested those for blood. And then after that testing, I looked for semen and tested it for semen as well.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, I'm going to try to zoom in on the photo. Don't know that I can get this to zoom in. There. All right, so let's talk about what these indications mean. Is this a photo that you took or documentation that you created to demonstrate the areas that you looked at?
Yes.
Okay, if you could explain just initially what we're talking about in this corner.
So my first testing was to identify blood. The PHE pause area is the chemical test that I use to help identify blood. And it's a color test where I will swab the stain, add chemicals to that swab. A positive would be would develop a pink color. No color change would be a negative reaction. So those two areas were positive, and I circled them so I would know where they were located when going back later to take any DNA cuttings. And the TMP pause area is one of the testing that I do. It's a presumptive test to help locate areas that may be semen. And that is basically a color test as well, where I will spray the garment with water and then chemicals that react with acid phosphatase, which is a constituent of semen. A blue color that develops would be positive for that enzyme and would be circled so that I know where it's at, because I add a filter paper on top of that garment, and then the area that is a blue positive will be circled so that I know where it's at, because that obviously the filter paper is thrown away. And so those are positive reactions that I circled to take on for DNA later at a later time.
Okay, so the PHE positive signifies what?
That is the color test that I use to help identify blood.
And the TMP positive signifies what?
The test that I'm using to help locate the acid phosphatase, the constituent of semen. And these both are presumptive tests, which means that that it is found in high concentrations in these, but is not confirmatory for blood or semen.
And let me ask you, does anything about the serology process or this part of the analysis affect your ability to do the DNA analysis next?
No.
And if we can look at that section and explain.
And that is another area that was positive. So I swabbed that area and tested it with the color test, and it was positive. So then I confirmed the presence of blood by doing another test, which is a hemotrace card is used. It's very similar to a pregnancy test. What I would do is I would swab that area, put the swab in buffer solution, and add it to the card. And the card has a control area and a test area. The control area, if there is a line present, lets me know that the test is working properly. And the test area, if there is a line, indicates that it's a positive reaction. And if there is no line in that area, then it is negative. And in this case, it was positive. So I know that blood is present in that.
Great. So let's go back then to talk about the DNA results that were found in this particular item. When we talk about cutting 2.1, explain how the lab processes like a clothing item that's large and has multiple spots on it or stains.
If I have a positive serology result, I will take a cutting of that area, put it in an envelope, label it, and seal it back up. So whenever I'm doing my DNA analysis on that, I can take it back out, take another smaller cutting. With DNA, you only need a limited amount of sample. It's around a centimeter by centimeter square piece. So it's very small that I am extracting for DNA. So I will take cuttings from the different areas on the item and put them in envelopes for later testing.
Okay, so let's talk about cutting 2.1. What location on the nightgown did cutting 2.1 come from?
It came from the bottom right corner, or
Sorry, actually skipped that one. So go ahead and tell the jury, well, that's 2.2. Okay. There's 2.1. So go ahead and explain to the jury the DNA results from cutting 2.1.
the YSTR profile from item 2.1 is a mixture. Guy Allen and his paternal relatives can be included as a contributor to this mixture. Utilizing profiles from the US YSTR database, this profile has been observed in 3 of 2,817 African Americans, 0 of 3,299 Caucasians, and 0 of 1,711 Hispanics. Applying a 95% upper confidence interval, this profile is expected to occur with the following frequencies: 1 in 364 African Americans, 1 in 1,103 Caucasians, and 1 in 5,702 Hispanics. Eugene Mitchell can be excluded as a contributor to this mixture.
Okay, so you were able to exclude Mitchell and include with those statistics Guy Allen and his paternal relatives.
Yes, with the calculations.
Okay. And I don't think I asked you about the 2.2 location. Let me just ask you to explain the serology results there.
The serology results for the stain for item 2.2 contains blood. Presumptive testing for human origin was positive. The DNA results, the quantity and or quality of human DNA from item 2.2, cutting of stain from nightgown, was insufficient to obtain a profile. So I did not get a profile from that item to do any comparisons.
Okay. And cutting 2.3.
The DNA profile from item 2.3, cutting of stain from nightgown, is consistent with a mixture of at least 3 individuals. Although Guy Allen is inconclusive as a contributor at one of the locations, Guy Allen and Sheila Devine can be included as contributors to this mixture. An estimated 1 person in 240 million random unrelated individuals could be a contributor to this mixture based on the relevant United States populations. Due to the limited presence of an additional contributor, Eugene Mitchell cannot be included or excluded as a contributor to this mixture. The YSTR profile from item 2.3 is a mixture. The major profile matches Guy Allen and his paternal relatives at all loci. Utilizing the US YSTR database, this profile has been observed in 0 of 5,871 African Americans, 0 of 6,714 Caucasians, and 0 of 3,504 Hispanics. Applying a 95% upper confidence interval, this profile is expected to occur with the following frequencies: 1 in 1,961 African Americans, 1 in 2,242 Caucasians, and 1 in 1,171 Hispanics. Eugene Mitchell and his paternal relatives can be included as a contributor to this mixture. Utilizing profiles from the US YSTR database, this profile has been observed in 18 of 2,817 African Americans, 41 of 3,290 Caucasians, 3 of 1,711 Hispanics, and 2 of 118 Native Americans. Applying a 95% upper confidence interval, this profile is expected to occur with the following frequencies: 1 in 106 African Americans, 1 in 62 Caucasians, 1 in 221 Hispanics, and 1 in 19 Native Americans.
Okay, so the initial analysis on the 2.3 cutting was autosomal, the
Yes.
mixture that included Sheila Devine and Guy Allen.
Yes,
Okay,
with the
and then-
estimated frequency.
Okay, and then the additional YSTR, Guy Allen matched the major profile with the statistics that you talked about.
Yes,
Okay. And in that one, Eugene Mitchell was included as a contributor and his paternal relatives.
yes, with the statistics that I talked about.
All right, let's talk about some additional cuttings on the nightgown. And I'm going to start by zooming in so we can talk about where the cuttings are. So cutting 2.4,
Yes.
were there any serology results to note?
Item 2.4 is a cutting where I tested that area for phenolphthalein positive, which is the presumptive test for blood. The entire item is reported out as item 2 contains blood. Presumptive testing for human origin was positive. And I took a cutting from item 2.4 and did the DNA analysis on it.
Okay, let's talk about the DNA results from 2.4.
The female DNA profile from item 2.4, cutting from nightgown, matches Sheila Devine at all loci. The estimated frequency of this profile is 1 person in 156 sextillion based on the relevant United States populations. This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell or Guy Allen. The YSTR profile from item 2.4 is a mixture. Although he is inconclusive as a contributor at one of the locations, Guy Allen and his paternal relatives can be included as a contributor to this mixture. Utilizing profiles from the US YSTR database, this profile has been observed in 2 of 2,817 African Americans, 0 of 3,299 Caucasians, and 0 of 1,711 Hispanics. Applying a 95% upper confidence interval, this profile is expected to occur with the following frequencies: 1 in 448 African Americans, 1 in 1,103 Caucasians, and 1 in 572 Hispanics. Eugene Mitchell can be excluded as a contributor to this mixture.
Let's talk about cutting 2.5. If you can, go ahead and explain the results from that testing.
The YSTR profile from item 2.5 is a mixture. Although Guy Allen is inconclusive as a contributor at one of the locations and no results were obtained at another location, Guy Allen and Eugene Mitchell and their paternal relatives can be included as contributors to this mixture. Utilizing profiles from the US YSTR database, this profile has been observed in 30 of 2,817 African Americans, 77 of 3,299 Caucasians, 17 of 1,711 Hispanics, and 2 of 118 Native Americans. Applying a 95% upper confidence interval, this profile is expected to occur with the following frequencies: 1 in 69 African Americans, 1 in 36 Caucasians, 1 in 67 Hispanics, and 1 in 19 Native Americans.
Okay. So was that all the testing that was conducted on the nightgown?
Yes, that was all of the analysis I did.
Okay. And was there also an item that was sent on for trace analysis?
Yes, the hairs collected in this item was transferred to trace.
Okay. Let me ask you about, would you typically examine an item of clothing for touch DNA?
No, it is not our lab policy to test items for touch DNA, clothing items for touch DNA, because it is very difficult to locate an exact spot of where we would need to swab for analysis.
Right. So is touch DNA visible to the naked eye?
No, it's not.
And is there a test where you can isolate touch DNA like you could blood, saliva, or semen?
We have to go from what information is provided about it being touch. If we receive certain items, maybe a hammer or that we know that had been handled or touched, we would swab the area of interest and take that on for DNA. But clothing items are more difficult to pinpoint an exact location to do my analysis.
Okay. And if a clothing item is worn by an individual, like if this is Sheila Devine's robe and she wore it, would you expect her DNA from the epithelial cells, so essentially touch DNA, but not from her hands, potentially to be all over the robe?
The clothing items are not considered touch DNA. They would be an owner. We do swabs from around the neck or the cuffs to try to get a profile from that, because it is items that are up against the skin, and then you could get a profile from those cells.
Okay, so if I'm wearing something, I would potentially deposit enough DNA on the collar or the cuffs that you could swab it and get a meaningful sample.
Yes.
Okay, and by meaningful sample, I'm talking about one where there's enough DNA to develop a profile.
Yes, I would do DNA on that item and see if I could get a profile.
Okay, and we talked a little bit about how some sources of DNA are richer than others. So if I touch this table right now, is it possible that I leave touch DNA?
It depends. There are individuals that may shed more DNA than another. If you have brief contact with it, you might leave less DNA than someone else. So it depends on the length of time and the individual, whether or not I would be able to get a profile from that.
Okay, and is it more difficult to collect touch DNA from clothing than from, say, a hard surface?
Just like I had mentioned before, there isn't an exact location for me to be able to swab. And it's our case acceptance policy to not do touch DNA on clothing or items that have been large items that have been handled.
Okay, by large items that have been handled, do you mean handled by multiple people or?
I'm just meaning if someone had grabbed someone, or I had a purse or a bag or something of that sort. Unless we had a detailed description, we would not accept that into the laboratory for analysis.
Okay, and if there's some touch DNA on the robe that Sheila has been wearing, so that Sheila's DNA, we can assume will be present on a robe if she's been wearing it regularly, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so if there's touch DNA, we talked about how touch DNA isn't a particularly rich source of DNA. So can a DNA sample be overwhelmed by DNA that's present from another source?
Yes, if there is a biological fluid present, it would be a richer source and would possibly overwhelm any other contact.
So you might not be able to isolate out smaller samples.
I would not be able to determine the source of the DNA and would only be able to focus. That's why we do serological analysis, is so that we can focus on the rich sources of DNA.
All right, let's move on to a couple of other items.
Actually, counsel, we're going to take a break real quick. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is now 10:35. We're going to take a morning break. If you'll please be back in front of the courtroom at 10:45. The admonition still applies. All rise for the jury. All right, you all may be seated. Ma'am, I know you're an experienced witness. I just want to remind you, you're still under oath. You can't talk about your testimony with anyone. If you need to take a break, there's a restroom in the back, and one of my deputies can escort you back there if you'd like, or you can stay where you are. All right, going off the record.
9.16, that was one she All right, Mr.
Thank you, Josh. You all may be seated. Does anyone have anything to report to the court with respect to the admonition? Good. Go ahead, Ms. Gray.
And Ms. Phelps, let me ask you, when you're submitted an item like the sexual assault examination and evidence collection kit, when you receive the swabs, so if the kit itself, the box is labeled Exhibit 9, when you remove the swabs, are each of them given as we're talking about here, numbers like 9.15, 9.17, and so forth?
Yes, I will go through the kit contents and give them a sub-item number.
Okay, and I'm going to show you this stack of envelopes. So once they're analyzed, are they then sent back to LMPD to be packaged and stored separately from, since they were already removed from the rape kit? Are they then all packaged separately since you analyzed each item separately?
When I'm finished with my analysis, if they are removed from the kit, then they'll be returned to the agency. And if I'm not sure what they do after I release it, if they repackage it or what they do with the item that's removed from the kit.
Okay, well, let me ask you a little bit about when you examine the evidence, what steps are taken at the lab to maintain the integrity of the evidence?
Whenever I am doing my analysis, I only have one piece of evidence out at a time, and each item is packaged and sealed individually. And whenever I do my analysis, I will clean my lab bench area, pull the item out, and examine that item before repackaging and sealing it up and pulling out another item.
Okay, so let me give you an example. When we're talking about 9.15 and 9.17, are those swabs that were collected in the rape kit ever examined? Do you have both of those items out at the same time?
No, I do not.
And are they ever put back in the same envelope with each other?
No.
And is that the process that's followed, the same process with every piece of evidence that the lab receives?
Yes, we only have one piece of evidence out at a time and examine that before moving on to the next item.
Okay. And were there items from the sexual assault kit that were sent on to a different lab? And I think I'm looking at report number 3.
Yes.
Right. Can we talk about what was also then submitted to a different lab?
Yes.
Okay. Which items from the sexual assault kit were submitted to Guardian Forensic Services for fecal analysis?
Item 9.2, right knee swabs from Sheila Devine. Item 9.13, left foot heel swabs from Sheila Devine. Item 9.16, partial mouthpiece from Sheila Devine. Item 9.17, lips, chin, and nair swabs from Sheila Devine. Item 9.18, forehead swabs from Sheila Devine. And item 9.19, debris collected from hair from Sheila Devine.
Okay, and was that sent out for additional testing after you had conducted the DNA test?
It was sent out for fecal determination to Guardian Forensics, then came back into the lab for additional testing.
Okay, and when you use a swab for DNA testing, do you use the entire swab to develop your profile, or explain to the jury how that works?
Whenever I'm taking cuttings for DNA, I only take a small cutting from the swab, and we'll place that in a tube for DNA analysis. The item is not consumed.
And so the cuttings that were sent to Guardian Labs, was any of that cuttings that you had already used in your analysis? Or are they separate cuttings?
Any cuttings that I had taken from the swabs would have been processed and used. The cuttings would have been removed, and I would have used or not consumed any of the evidence for that allows for additional testing.
Okay, and by additional testing, is a portion of every sample also maintained? So if defense counsel requests testing, there's sample available for that?
Yes, if we ever run into a consumption issue, then we have to get approval in order to consume the item.
All right, and were there any other items that you listed in report number 3 in addition to the material from the sexual assault evidence collection kit that were sent on to Guardian Labs for fecal analysis?
Yes. Item 3, piece of unknown substance from dresser and bedroom. Item 8, cloth material from bedroom floor.
Okay. Is the Kentucky State Police Lab able to do fecal analysis?
No, we do not do that type of a analysis at the lab.
Okay. Does that type of analysis require, I guess, training and equipment that the Kentucky State Police Lab doesn't have?
If we were to bring something new online, it would have to go through a new method, would have to go through an internal validation, and training would also be required before bringing it online to use on casework.
Okay. And so by fecal analysis, I'm talking about determining whether or not a substance is feces. So KSP labs do not have available testing to determine if a substance is feces or not.
That's correct.
Okay. So is that why items were sent on to Guardian Labs?
Yes.
All right. If we could move on next to item 4, which I believe is your report number 1.
Yes.
All right, starting with item 4. And again, when we're talking about sub-items 4.1 and 4.2, is that basically to designate that they were swabs from item 4?
Yes. So item 4.1 are swabs from the inside of red condom, and swabs, item 4.2 are swabs from the outside of red condom.
Okay, and when you performed your serological analysis, what were the results?
Item 4 contained semen. Hair was found on item 4.
Okay. And when you completed your DNA analysis, what were the results?
The male DNA profile from item 4.1, swabs from inside of red condom, sperm fraction, matches Guy Allen at all loci. The estimated frequency of this profile is 1 person in 2.1 sextillion based on the relevant United States populations.
How many, I don't mean to interrupt you, but how many zeros are in sextillion?
21.
Okay.
This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell or Sheila Devine. Additional DNA is present, but is too limited for interpretation. The DNA profile from item 4.1, swabs from inside of red condom, non-sperm fraction, and item 4.2, swabs from outside of red condom, is consistent with a mixture of at least 2 individuals. Sheila Devine and Guy Allen can be included as contributors to this mixture. An estimated 1 person in 43 billion random unrelated individuals could be a contributor to this mixture based on the relevant United States populations. Eugene Mitchell can be excluded as a contributor to this mixture.
All right, and then item 6.
Item 6 contains P30. Other testing for semen was negative. The DNA profile from item 6.1, swabs from inside of condom, is consistent with a mixture of at least 2 individuals. Sheila Devine and Guy Allen can be included as contributors to this mixture. An estimated 1 person and 43 billion random unrelated individuals could be a contributor to this mixture based on the relevant United States populations. Eugene Mitchell can be excluded as a contributor to this mixture.
Okay, and when we're talking about this testing, are we talking about autosomal testing?
Yes. The female DNA profile from item 6.2, swabs from outside of condom, matches Sheila Devine at all loci. The estimated frequency of this profile is 1 person in 150 sextillion based on the relevant United States populations. This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell or Guy Allen.
Did you also receive CSU Exhibit 36, a Heaven Hill vodka bottle? Report number 2, I believe.
Yes,
And did you perform any analysis on that?
I performed DNA analysis. The DNA profile from item 17, swabs from Heaven Hill premium vodka bottle, is consistent with a mixture of at least 2 individuals. Although he is inconclusive as a contributor at 2 of the locations, Eugene Mitchell and Sheila Devine can be included as contributors to this mixture. An estimated 1 person and 69 million random unrelated individuals could be a contributor to this mixture based on the relevant United States populations. Guy Allen can be excluded as a contributor to this mixture.
Okay, and so we're talking about swabs from the rim of the Heaven Hill bottle. Why would you swab the rim as opposed to trying to get touch DNA from the surface of the bottle?
That would be in contact with the mouth, so it would be an area that would be of interest to get a DNA profile.
So you're more likely to get a richer source and therefore be able to do a reliable comparison.
Yes, to have more DNA.
And did you also receive what's labeled as CSU Exhibit 40, a black coat?
Yes,
All right, and did you do analysis on that?
I did.
All right. And I think that's your report number 6. Can we talk about the results there?
Presumptive testing for blood was positive on item 20, black hooded footlocker coat. No semen was found on item 20, and hair was collected from item 20.
Okay, let's go through the photo first so we can talk about the locations of the cuttings.
These were cuttings made by a trace analyst before I had received the item, and I just documented that in my picture.
Okay.
The area at the bottom gave a positive reaction for the presumptive test for blood, and I took 2 additional swabs from that area to take on for DNA analysis.
Okay, and then the other spot that's notated, is that from a cutting from the other analyst?
Yes.
Okay.
And this is another positive area that was noted, and 2 additional swabs were collected for DNA analysis.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about the DNA results and the other serology results. So the only presumptive positive were for blood.
That's correct.
Was there any semen found?
No semen was found.
Okay. And let's talk about the DNA results from the swabs from the cuff of the jacket.
The male DNA profile from item 20.2, cuff, swabs of left cuff of coat, matches Eugene Mitchell et al. Loci. The estimated frequency of this profile is 1 person in 1 sextillion based on the relevant United States populations. This profile does not match Terrence Spalding, Sheila Devine, or Guy Allen. Additional DNA is present, but is too limited for interpretation. I also did YSTR analysis on this item. The YSTR profile from item 20.2 matches Eugene Mitchell and his paternal relatives at all loci. Utilizing the US YSTR database and assuming a single source profile, the DNA match probability of Eugene Mitchell being the source of the YSTR profile as opposed to a randomly selected individual from the same population is estimated to be 439 times more likely for African American, 455 times more likely for Caucasian, 714 times more likely for Hispanic, 439 times more likely for Native American.
Okay.
The YSTR profile from 20.2 does not match Guy Allen or Terrence Spalding.
Okay, so we talked a little bit before about, they'll hear testimony later about the source of this coat, but assuming that this coat was collected from Eugene Mitchell. If you knew who the owner was, would you expect, I think when you talked about the areas that you would look for to determine who had been wearing an item, that it would typically be things like the cuff and the neck?
Yes.
Okay, so if Eugene Mitchell was wearing this coat, would you expect to find his DNA inside the
Yes.
cuff of the jacket?
Yes.
All right. And the DNA swab from the zipper, the sample simply wasn't sufficient to do any kind of comparison.
The DNA profile from item 20.1, swabs from around zipper of coat, is too limited for interpretation.
Okay. Were you able to obtain any DNA from any other area on the coat?
Those were the only areas tested for DNA.
All right, now at some point after items were sent off to Guardian Labs for fecal analysis, were any of those items then returned to KSP Labs for additional analysis?
Yes.
Okay, and starting with report number 8. Right. Item 8. Did you perform any analysis on that?
Yes, I performed serological analysis and DNA analysis.
So let's talk about that.
No semen was found on item 8. Presumptive testing for blood was positive on item 8, but the presence of blood could not be confirmed through further analysis. And hair was also collected.
Okay. And what about the DNA analysis? What area was swabbed to perform DNA analysis?
The brown chunk was swabbed for DNA analysis, and the DNA profile from item 8.1, which the swabs of chunk from cloth material, is a mixture of at least 2 individuals. The major profile matches Sheila Devine. The estimated frequency of this profile is 1 person in 100 billion random, unrelated individuals based on the relevant United States populations. This profile does not match Eugene Mitchell, Guy Allen, or Terrence Spalding. Due to the limited presence of the minor contributor, no meaningful comparisons can be made to the remaining profile.
Okay, so in this particular, for this particular piece of evidence, Guy Allen and Eugene Mitchell can't be excluded. You just can't reach any determination about the presence of their DNA.
Yes, so all I'm doing are making comparisons to the major profile.
All right, and item 9.16, which was from the sexual assault evidence collection kit, was that returned to the lab after it went to Guardian Labs?
Yes,
And were you able to do any further analysis on that?
yes. I performed DNA analysis on 9.16. The DNA profile from item 9.16 is a mixture of at least 2 individuals. Assuming the presence of Sheila Devine, the remaining profile is too limited for meaningful comparisons.
Okay, so again, Guy Marcus Allen's not excluded, Eugene Mitchell's not excluded. You just can't reach any conclusions about. Does that mean that it has to be something that
Means that I'm not comparing it.
the swab? We heard Amanda Corzine, the sexual assault nurse examiner, yes, that victim was in the hospital. Did the lab ever perform any? Did the lab results for
I received the swabs from the partial mouthpiece.
All right, and do you, like, once that was returned to Kentucky State Police Lab, did you perform at the unknown branch? Trace for further analysis.
Item 3 contains hair. And that would have been
If we could go back to some of the items that were collected from the original scene, it would be, I'll ask you about, we talked about the audio video cables from the living room were submitted for test.
item 12, audio video cable from living room. On that item, the partial DNA profile from swabs from end of cable is consistent with a mixture of at least 2 individuals. Although she is inconclusive as a contributor at 2 of the locations, Sheila Devine can be included as a contributor